you so much for coming. My name is Laura Fisher, and I'm one of the organizers for the Civic Series. So I'm going to start off just by giving a little bit about what the Civic Series is, and then get a sense a little bit about who you are and why you're here. And then I'm going to turn over to Adam, who's going to introduce our amazing speaker tonight. So before I forget, let me just go over some logistics. So the bathrooms are back there. Obviously the exit is right here. There is water if you want to grab some water. Feel free to do that. In terms of the length of this session, we'll start with about 30-minute overview from our speaker, Dr. Jim Walsh, and then we'll have about an hour or so for question and discussion. And the event will end at 7:30. If people want to stay until 8, that's fine. We just have to get kicked out. We get kicked out at 8 o'clock, so we can't stay any later than 8. Okay, so again, thank you for being here. The Civic Series started because I was pretty much just tired of feeling dumb about not knowing what was going on. And I feel like there was no place to actually understand or know. Like if I wanted to learn about the war in Afghanistan, or if I wanted to learn about what's actually happening with Russia and Ukraine, sure, I could read a bunch of articles, or I could try to tackle a huge Wikipedia page, or I could read a book or take a course. That's not what I wanted. I wanted like a basic background overview in a couple of hours and really get my questions answered, right? Because there's not really a place where you can go to get questions answered. So that's why I started the Civic Series. And I'm really excited that Adam Dingle, Rachel Abrams is helping. She's also an organizer and helping putting these on. So this is our 9th Civic Series, I think. Our 9th one, and we've held on all different kinds of topics, and really the point is for you to get what you want out of it. It's really for you to get your questions answered. So the intention of the session is to be like a 101, like what is going on in this area, what is a thing that you've been wanting to know, but like haven't been able to find out yet. Maybe there are things you don't even know, so that's what this is all about. All right, and obviously it's about the Iran nuclear deal. I handed you all surveys, or Rachel handed you all surveys. Before you leave tonight, if you have to leave early, or if you're staying around to the end, it's really helpful to get your surveys, because we really want to make this as valuable as possible. So if you could just fill that out and give it back to me, that would be really excellent, and we'll follow up with an email as well. So now Blake is going to be recording the session, and we are going to hopefully put it on the website. And there are a lot of people who wanted to come tonight but couldn't come, or far away. So if for whatever reason you don't want to be on video or don't want to be recorded, then I'd recommend sitting in a place. I mean, maybe you want to sit over there. Yeah, so sit like over there, or maybe in that seat there if you don't want to be recorded. No, sit down. Nice try. Or you can tell me, and we can just make sure that your question or your face or whatever is not included. We want to be respectful of that. So how many of you have never been to a Civic Series event before? Yeah, okay. So lots of new people here. That's really sweet. Yeah, this is Rachel's first event too. She's been so passionate about the Civic Series the past few months, and now she's finally able to see what it's all about. So thank you so much for coming here. I really appreciate it. Did I miss anything? I don't think so. Oh, the ground rules. The ground rules. Okay, sorry, very quickly, some ground rules. So first of all, there are no dumb questions. Really, there are no dumb questions. I'm willing to be the dumbest person in the room. And if you have a question, likely somebody else has a question too. In our Israel-Palestine session, someone asked, well, I could kind of tell that there was a question about like, what a Palestinian really was. So I just asked, what's a Palestinian? And other people actually had that question too. So I don't think there'll be a question about what is an Aryan, but anyway, feel free to ask, like this is what the whole point is to ask those kinds of questions. Second, the purpose of the session is not to be about debate. You're welcome to have debates, after the Civic Series, but if you really want to get really deep in a topic, I ask you to, have that afterwards. Jim might be available to just speak with you a little bit afterwards, but that's not the purpose of this session. We're not to go really deep into one thing, so just keep that in mind. Also, for Q&As, we're going to take one question per person, and then we'll take multiple questions from the same person, just to make sure people get to ask their questions. Okay, so with all of that said, I'll turn it over to Adam. I did. Okay, yeah.
All right. As Lars said, so glad you could all make it. We have an empty chair sitting right there with some more chairs.
It's Elijah.
It has your name on it.
Yeah. That's what happens when we know who you are.
Welcome everybody again. I've really been looking forward to this talk. This is the first series we've had since May. security and a research associate at MIT's Security Studies program. Dr. Walsh's research and writings focus on international security, and in particular topics involving nuclear weapons and terrorism. Dr. Walsh has testified before the U.S. Senate on the issue of nuclear terrorism and on Iran's nuclear program. He's one of only a handful of Americans who's traveled to both Iran and North Korea for talks with officials about nuclear issues. So without further ado, Dr. Walsh.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for. I would hold off on that till the end. Okay. You may have buyer's remorse. I want to thank Laura and you and all of you for coming, particularly the people who have come here for their first venture. I think it's so important. In a time long ago in a place far away, I did things like this, and I think it's important, ideas and conversation, especially at a time when things are so bitter and polarized. So I appreciate the opportunity to be with you. I apologize that I'm not wearing a suit. I thought about it, and I'm happy to see most of you. When you're in this role, sometimes you have to act the part. But most of you, this is your first time thing, because that probably means you weren't here for the session on North Korea, which was done by my good friend from Tufts, Dr. Lee, who always wears a suit. I think he showers with a suit. So I knew he was going to make me look bad. Now my mocking of him is recorded for him to see. So, as said earlier, I'm going to speak for 30 minutes. I'm going to start my timer. And I keep a timer because I've done this a lot. And I know that after a while, people pretty much turn into that. So this is sort of beat the clock for me. How much can I get in before you turn to that? And it might be helpful, a little bit about me, but with respect to Iran, I've been to Iran several times. I've spent 20 hours in meetings with President Ahmadinejad and his successor. That says 10, and that's him in the corner. But I just saw President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif on Sunday in New York at a private meeting, so that number has to be increased. But I've spent a lot of time spoken to a lot of Iranian officials over time, and spoken to the American negotiating team, the Iranian negotiating team, the British negotiating team. What I'm going to do in this talk, I'm going to talk mostly about Iran, but context is always important. Social scientists will tell you that you can really only understand a phenomenon if you're able to compare it to something else. So I want to put Iran's interest in nuclear technology in some sort of broader historical context. Then I want to talk about Iran, the country, dig down into Iran's nuclear program, and end by a very brief overview of this Iran nuclear agreement that we just concluded. So let's start with the nuclear context. And what I'm going to tell you is that this is it's probably very different than the image you have in your heads. Now that is a deeply offensive and strange photo. That is Miss Atomic Bomb 1955. That is a mushroom cloud she is wearing. And I put this slide up here in some way to symbolize a couple of things. One is, we don't think about nuclear weapons today like we thought about nuclear weapons in the past. In 1955, when you could have a Atomic bomb, you really couldn't have a Atomic bomb today. But the other thing is that nuclear weapons are different than other weapons. We've never had a chemical weapons or a biological weapons, even in the 1950s. And the reason why these weapons are different, in part, is because, unlike a machine gun, unlike a tank, unlike a bomb, these are weapons that are rarely used. They were used once in 1945, or twice, one adversary, 2 bombings, and have not been used since. And so the way you think, if you're using a tank, you have battlefield experience, and you know where tanks work and what they do and the situations in which they make sense. We really haven't used nuclear weapons since 1945. So the ideas in our head about the weapons turns out to be very, very important. And we have specific ideas in our heads, and a lot of them are wrong. So let's think about how we imagine proliferation. Proliferation being the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries. Well, I think we have this idea that it spreads, 2, 4, 6, 8. The Nazis had a bomb program, so we got worried, and we started our bomb program, which was successful. But when we dropped the bomb, that freaked out Russia and China. And so they got bombs. When they got bombs, their enemies got bombs, and on it goes. And that is the graph there of the total number of nuclear weapon states over time. It just increases into the horizon. Now, if you're good at reading graphs, you see actually that slope is pretty gentle and it flattens out at the end. And what's really happening here is this. Yes, over time we've slowly accumulated some nuclear weapon states, but this is the rate of proliferation over time. How many new countries joined the nuclear weapons club each decade? Well, that number peaked in the 1960s when Israel, France, and China joined the nuclear weapons club. But in every succeeding decade, fewer and fewer countries have acquired nuclear weapons. I don't think most people get that. They have the image that 2, 4, 6, 8, 15 more. No, actually, the rate has gone down over time. This is some of the countries that had an interest in nuclear weapons. Some of them dabbled. Some of them went quite far down the path. All of them stopped. And so we have the 10 nuclear weapon states, but we have some 30 countries that started down the path towards nuclear weapons, stopped, and reversed course. The countries in green were the 3 countries of the former Soviet Union that inherited nuclear assets after the fall of the Soviet Union and then gave them up. So a lot of countries had interest in nuclear weapons. Very few of them went on to become nuclear weapon states. In fact, you could argue that nonproliferation is the biggest public policy success of the 20th century, on par with the ending of slavery in the 19th century. We have far fewer nuclear weapon states than were predicted by policymakers, experts, academics. Fewer states today are seeking nuclear weapons than ever before. In the 50s and 60s, you had dozens. Most of the folks on that list we just looked at were from the 50s and 60s. You had a lot of countries that were interested. That candidate pool has shrunk. Today, the number of states interested in nuclear weapons is less than a handful. So not only do we have fewer nuclear weapon states, we have fewer countries seeking nuclear weapon states than at any point in human history. Since the 1990s, more countries gave up nuclear weapons, South Africa and the 3 states of the former Soviet Union, than have acquired nuclear weapons. In that category, only North Korea has acquired nuclear weapons since the 1990s. And of the countries that have violated the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the sort of rules of nuclear behavior in our planet, of the 9 violators, only 1 went on to become a nuclear weapon state, and that was North Korea. So, as we look at the case of Iran, and we look at other cases of proliferation, there's a tendency to sort of treat this with breathless anxiety, that, we're just around the corner from dozens of nuclear weapon states, when actually the historical record would suggest we're pretty good at stopping this, far better than anyone could have possibly guessed. So let's talk a little bit about Iran. Those are I don't expect you to know the faces, but those are the main leaders. Khomeini is up in the left-hand corner, the founder of the Iranian Revolution. The current supreme leader, Khamenei, in the middle. To his right, this is sort of organized based on power and importance. To his right is the head of the Revolutionary Guard. There's the President Rouhani, and that's Mr. Larijani, who's head of their legislature, which they call the Majlis. So before I go any further, let me just hear from you. When I say Iran, what do you think of? You can just randomly throw things out.
Nicest country in the world.
Nicest country in the world. Have not heard that.
I heard somebody that went to every single country in the world without flying on a plane.
Yes.
And he said the people in Iran were the nicest people ever. They
Well,
took him into his home.
Yes. They've treated me pretty well. But nicest, that's a pretty big claim. Other reactions? The Shah, yes. Democracy? Theocracy. Anything else? Nothing else comes to mind. We've been exposed for 3 years to Iran stuff. What?
They speak Arabic. They're a Muslim country. Conflicts.
Yeah. Over here, I don't want to be against the Southern.
I think of dryness for some reason.
That's what there's a lot. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, let's actually look at Iran. Hostages, yes, good one. Very good. No one said nuclear, terrorism. Pardon me? So this, when you walk into a government official's office in Iran, this is the map they have on their wall. And not surprisingly, because it has Iran at the center of the universe. And like Americans, Iranians do think that they are the center of their region. They look to a distant past of imperial glory. They are not Arabs, they're Persians. We'll talk about this in a minute. And they think of themselves as being the most important country in the region. You all are too young for this joke, but I used to say that they are the Rodney Dangerfield of Southwest Asia because they feel like they don't get any respect. And so they had this glorious past. Recently, not so much. Having been taken over by Britain, having been invaded by the Soviet or by Russia at the end of World War II, toppled by the U.S. and the British in '53. And so, again, they feel like they don't get any respect, and it shows. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. It's a country that, and I'm going to try to get through all this first, and then do stuff after. Think about Iran compared to the United States. The United States is surrounded by two big oceans and two large, weak neighbors. We won the jackpot of geography and from a national security standpoint, right? The oceans are not going to invade us. I don't think Canada is going. There was that one time, but I don't think Canada is really going to invade us. Iran is surrounded by one nuclear weapon state, Pakistan, war-torn country, Afghanistan, its arch rival, Saudi Arabia, Iraq that invaded it and fought an 8-year war, the Iran-Iraq War, which is now a country of some unknown future, and Turkey nearby, and Russia just beyond, in the old Soviet Union, and they shared a border with the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, they share a border with the former republics. So they have a lot of borders, and a lot of those borders have problems.
You're saying they still hang this somewhere? They still hang that?
This is the map. In almost every government office, that's the map. Let's see. Yeah. Well, I don't know if in the official one it is, but it's more or less like that. Iran, when you're a security studies guy, if it is, it's probably labeled Palestine. Labeled Palestine. Yeah, well, I mean, that might be my map, but when you're a security studies person, you try to, again, get some context by looking at fundamentals. What are the big fundamentals in security studies? The size of the country, the size of its economy, and the size of its military. That doesn't tell you everything, but that gives you pretty good first order a sense of who's who in the international system. So let's look at Iran and the U.S. Iran is roughly the size of Alaska. The United States is roughly the size of the United States. The GDP for Iran, about $1 trillion. U.S. economy, 14 trillion. So our economy is substantially larger than theirs. They spend about 20 billion on their military. We spend about 600 billion on our military. So, we are not equals. This is not the Soviet Union. For all the, I think Iran is a important regional player, but it is no Soviet Union. It's not a peer competitor. It can't threaten the United States of America. Who's who in Iranian politics? We did a little of this when that opening slide with the photos. Again, the supreme leader's at the top. The supreme leader is not like Kim Jong-un or some other dictator where everything is being controlled by the man at the top. Rather, the supreme leader is sort of, in the words of George W. Bush, the decider. Because Iran, contrary to what you would expect, has actually a pretty decentralized political system. There are centers of power spread across the government and even in the non-governmental area, as this slide indicates. And so you have competitions for power and a fractious politics. And the supreme leader sort of sits back and lets that play out and then comes in and weighs in at the end to decide a policy. But he's not managing day-to-day operations. But he is the most important person. The Guardian Council is another area, another institution that's important. It selects who gets to run for office or not, and so that very much has an impact on Iranian politics. Then you have the IRGC and the intelligence apparatus, President Rouhani. A tier down are the clergy who are aging in Iran, and the judiciary, private organizations. They have large, they're sort of like NGOs with millions of dollars in wealth that sort of act behind the scenes and interplay with government organizations. It's a very unusual setup. Larijani, who you'll remember is head of their Congress, as it were. And then the people do matter. Even though you had the Green Revolution, Green Uprising after the disputed 2009 election, you all remember pictures of that, people in the streets, and it was suppressed. That doesn't mean that the supreme leader can afford to ignore popular support. In fact, when President Rouhani was elected recently, 2013, it was a surprise election. Not only did he win, he won on the first ballot. No one expected him to win, certainly not on the first ballot. And the supreme leader took that as a message from the people that things were different. And as a result, I think that's what created the political space to have this nuclear negotiation. So the citizenship matters. It's not as important as these other centers of power, but it's not without some importance. I mean, compared to the other countries in the Middle East, it's pretty Republican. That's with a small r. That is to say, institutions represent the people. So in the case of the supreme leader, he's not elected popularly. He's selected by the Assembly of Experts. But the Assembly of Experts is directly elected by the Iranian people. So there are elements of democracy, elements of republicanism, and there are elements of authoritarianism altogether. Let's see how we're doing for time. Good. So let's talk a little bit about Iranian foreign policy. Of course, the Islamic Republic was born in 1979, the revolution that threw out the Shah. And what happens when you have revolutions? A revolution followed about a year and a half later by an existential war with Iraq, when Iraq invaded Iran. When you have revolution and war, you tend to get pretty extreme policies by a country early on. Revolution and war are among the most extreme circumstances that countries face. And so right after the revolution, there was a lot of talk about exporting the revolution to other countries. This naturally freaked out the other countries, the monarchies, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. You had a Iran-Iraq war, and this was a time when the foreign policy of Iran was both fiercely anti-US, remember the US had installed the Shah, and fiercely anti-Soviet. Remember the Soviets, godless communism, doesn't really sync up well with an Islamic republic. But after years of revolution, or more particularly after years of the Iran-Iraq war, which really took its toll on the Iranian people to fight what was then the bloodiest war on record in the region for 8 long years, people needed a break. And so what you saw was a turn beginning in the late 1980s, early 1990s, a turn towards pragmatism in their foreign policy, where the focus was not on ideology, but on interests. So for example, examples of this, in Armenia, the Islamic Republic, in its foreign policy, supports Christian Armenia over Muslim Azerbaijan in their conflict in the region. Why are they choosing a Christian nation over a brother of Muslims? Because that serves Iranian interests, national interests. Same thing in Syria. We can talk more about Syria. Again, Syria is a Ba'athist country. There's nothing at all ideologically simpatico with Iran at all, but Iran supports Syria because it's Iran's national interests. So interests over ideology begin to dominate Iranian foreign policy over time. You had the reformer Khatami talk about a dialogue of civilizations. The reaction to Khatami was Ahmadinejad, who spoke about rights and confrontation, but at least in his foreign policy was not that aggressive in the region. And then finally you have Rouhani, whose focus is on reform and engagement with the world. So this is another way of simply saying Iranian foreign policy has been dynamic. If you have a fixed picture of it, that's probably a mistake because it changes over time. So what are the things that influence that foreign policy? Well, one is religion and ideology. I mean, it is the Islamic Republic. It is born of a revolution. It's the defender of Shiism in the Islam faith as opposed to the majority Sunni sect, which predominates in the region. And it's anti-imperialist, hates the Russians, hates the Americans. But that's really not as important as you might have gathered from the last slide, not as important as it used to be. And national interests, security, internal security, external security, oil on which its economy depends, these are really the things that drive Iranian foreign policy. And looping back, I think psychology matters. I think the Iranians have a chip on their shoulder. I feel like they think that they're better than the Arabs, that their culture is more developed. And they're sort of bummed that they've been below them all these years, at least since 1945. And they have a sense of exceptionalism. Many Americans believe in a manifest destiny, that God has given the U.S. a special place in the world, and that we are supposed to fulfill this special mandate that God has given to the United States above all other countries. Now, sitting here in Central Square, that probably sounds pretty silly to you. But there are a lot of Americans who believe that, and certainly historically Americans have believed that. In every presidential campaign, I'll bet you $1 you're going to hear quite a bit of that. Well, the Iranians believe the same thing. They believe that they have a God-given special place in the region, and that they are superior to others in the region. And the final thing that people underestimate in terms of its influence on foreign policy is domestic politics. They have a vicious, factionalized domestic politics in which each side has the knives out trying to kill their opponent, metaphorically, mostly metaphorically, trying to get on top of the other. So sometimes a foreign policy will be adopted that has nothing to do with the external world, but reflects the infighting between factional groups in Iran, just like it does here in the United States. Iran is the odd one out. It's Persian, not Arab. It's Shia, not Sunni. It's a revolutionary republic surrounded by kings. We still have kings in the world. It's pan-Islamic. It's made Islam part of its national identity, and it doesn't want to have anything to do with outside great powers. Now, what's happening in Iran after the or in the region, after our invasion of Iraq in 2003, that had a lot of consequences. ISIS is one of those consequences. There are others. But from a regional standpoint, in my view, the biggest change has been we've gone from a three-player balancing game to a two-player brawl. What do I mean by that? In the old days, you had Iraq and Iran who were at each other's heads, battling back and forth, and then Saudi Arabia, which feared both of them. So if Iran got too powerful, like after the revolution, Saudi Arabia would take Iraq's side. But if Iraq got too powerful, like it did in Saudi's view after the early years of the Iran-Iraq War, it would go and support Iran. You had a third player to sort of join the weaker player if one player got too strong. After the war in Iraq, there is no Iraq. There is no three-player balancing. And all you have left is this brawl between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This is what animates the region right now. It's not about nuclear at all. It's about Saudi Arabia versus Iran. And you hear a lot of talk from the Israeli Prime Minister today at the UN, from members of Congress, how Iran is taking over the region, has its tentacles out, and it's grabbing all these places. That's actually the scorecard. So on Iran's team is Syria, and Assad is in retreat right now. Lebanon, which I guess you can call a state, sort of mixed, and Iraq, which is also have its own problems. Saudi Arabia's team, pretty much everyone else. And then if you look at how capable these countries are, and there will be a quiz after my talk, I want you to know that right now. So the top three are the Iran team, and everyone else is the Saudi team. So the first column is the size of the economy, GDP, population, sort of wealth. If you take all those people and divide it by how much money you have, how wealthy are individuals? And then military expenditures. I think the thing to pay attention to is this, look at that. So Iran has a really big population, and Saudi not so much. But Iran spends $20 billion on its defenses. Saudi Arabia spends $74 billion a year. Multiples, and has all these guys on their team. So, pardon me?
What's the spending going on?
Military. Mil spending. And, they have roughly the same GDP, right? But there are so many more Iranians, that means people in Saudi Arabia are a lot wealthier. But the real one here is that. So, I don't know who you would choose, but I know which team I'm choosing if I have to choose a team. I mean, not really, I'm not a big fan of Saudi Arabia. But this team is like way more powerful than that team. All right, so I wanted to give you a sense of Iran, the origins of its foreign policy, how it stacks up against us, how it stacks up against other states in the region, a little bit of its history. Let's talk about its nuclear program. First, its capabilities and ambitions. There are two sources of information that are better than all others. It's not even close when it comes to understanding Iran's nuclear program. One is the International Atomic Energy Agency reports that are issued now. It was monthly for a while. It's probably going to be less than monthly, but those are when IAEA goes on the ground into Iran and looks at Iran's nuclear facilities and reports on what Iran is doing. The second major source, or best source of information for Iran, is U.S. national intelligence. And in the U.S., we have 16 intelligence agencies, yes, 16, of which then there's the Director of National Intelligence who oversees those 16 agencies. And once a year, the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, testifies before Congress in open session about the threats that the U.S. faces. And on Iran, the message from the DNI has been consistent since 2007 and offered at high confidence. And so what does the DNI say about Iran? Iran has the capacity to eventually produce nuclear weapons, making the central issue its political will to do so. We assess Iran as keeping open the option to develop nuclear weapons, should it choose to do so. We do not know, however, if Iran will eventually decide to become a nuclear weapons state. So the DNI in this testimony says Iran had a nuclear weapons program in the late 1990s that it stopped in 2003. But it knows how to build centrifuges. And if you can build a centrifuge, and they've built 19,000 of them, then essentially you have a basic nuclear weapons capability. You cannot bomb the knowledge of how to build a centrifuge out of their heads. Even if we took them all away, they would still know how to build one. And that's not going away. So that horse is out of the barn. The good news, as I said, as he says, is that Iran had this program, stopped it in 2003, and has not made a decision to build nuclear weapons. You know, you often hear people talking about Iran's nuclear weapons program. There is not a nuclear weapons program. It halted it in 2003, and it has yet to make the bomb decision. What it did make was the capability decision. It said, I want to have the knowledge to be able to do this if circumstances warrant. And unfortunately, it does have that. But it's not made that fateful and final decision to build nuclear weapons. Now, this comes as a shock to people when they hear this. In fact, Chairman Levin, when the DNI testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, said, I read into that Iran had not made a decision as of this point to restart its nuclear weapons program. Is that correct? The ever effusive Mr. Clapper goes, yes, sir. Levin, okay, but what's your level of confidence that you have that as of this time they have not decided to restart that program? Is that a high level of confidence? Mr. Clapper, yes, it is. And then Clapper goes on to say, if we want to talk more about this, we should talk about it in closed session. I put that extra slide up there because let's compare what the image I'm sure some of us had in our minds with, and what's said on TV and what's said by members of Congress with the reality. So on the left-hand side, you often hear advocates say, our goal should be to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. The reality is Iran has a basic nuclear weapons capability. We're already past that, my friends. Iran has a nuclear weapons program. No, Iran halted its program in 2003. Iran is rushing to the bomb. No, Iran has not decided whether to build nuclear weapons. Remember that key phrase, the central issue is not a technical one because it has a capability, it's its political will to do so. Finally, a bomb is inevitable. DNI says no, bomb is not inevitable. I mean, this is a program that began in the overall nuclear program began in the mid-1980s. So, you know, that was a long time ago. They could have had a bomb by now if they had wanted a bomb. I see I have a young fan. This is sort of a history of we're just going to look at centrifuges for a second. So in 2003, we discovered, because they had hidden it, that they had built centrifuges. They built about 164 centrifuges. And international community freaked out, and they agreed to enter negotiations. So they stopped building centrifuges, and there were negotiations primarily with the Europeans between 2003 and 2005. At the time, the U.S. position was there had to be 0 centrifuges. You have built 164, you have to dismantle all 164. Iran, again, a prideful nation, said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to go to 0. We'll agree to some number, we'll agree to inspections, whatever it is, but we're not going to 0. The negotiations collapse, we impose sanctions, and they go from 164 centrifuges to 8,000 to 19,000. And that's where we are today, 19,000 centrifuges.
What exactly is a centrifuge?
So there are to build a nuclear weapon, you have to use materials that do not exist in nature. They have to be produced by the hands of human beings. And so those two materials are highly enriched uranium and plutonium. So there are 2 different materials you can make nuclear weapons with. Often they're combined, but you need at least one of them. So what a centrifuge does is take natural occurring uranium and pulls out the isotope for uranium that you can use that produces a fission that splits it, where you can split an atom and create either nuclear energy or a nuclear weapon. And so centrifuges and on the plutonium side, reprocessing, are the two most important nuclear technologies with respect to nuclear weapons. If you manage that, you can figure out all the rest of it. The hardest thing to do is to extract enough uranium-235 that you can make a bomb. And so there are different ways that you can do to pull out the good uranium for bomb making or for power plant fuel from the bad uranium that is worthless. Centrifuges are the main way we do it today, and it works in simple terms. A centrifuge, it's like a salad spinner. Imagine that the water in your salad spinner on your salad is the material that you need to make a bomb. But that water's all in that salad, right? So you put the salad, the lettuce in the thing, and you press it down and it spins really fast, and what happens? The water all comes out to the side. Well, that water is the uranium-235 that then you would scoop up out of the centrifuge, metaphorically speaking, and then use either for fuel at 3.3 to 5% enrichment. That's good for fuel for a nuclear power plant. At 80 or 90% enrichment, it's good for a nuclear weapon. And there's no difference. If you can enrich to 3%, you can enrich to 80%. They are exactly the same process. Okay, are we good? I just want to give you some sense of the history of where their program has come, because this will come up later. All right, let's talk about the nuclear agreement, and I'm almost done. You know, this nuclear agreement, the agreement itself is 159 pages, and the UN Security Council resolution is another 100 plus. Very hard to summarize in one slide. So I'm just going to walk through this quickly, and then you can ask me questions about it, because I only have another slide left anyway. So what the agreement does, let me go back for a second. So these are the four folks. There are many people, include men and women. Wendy Sherman is there, who participated in negotiating this agreement. But we obviously have at the top, we have John Kerry, our own John Kerry, who is Secretary of State. That's Foreign Minister Zarif, someone I've known for more than a decade. Got his PhD at the University of Denver. And then for the local crowd, we have Ernie Moniz, professor at MIT, and their head of their nuclear program. He's head of Department of Energy. And head of their nuclear program, Mr. Salahi, who is a PhD nuclear engineer from MIT. And so I think it ended up sort of being rather important that these two guys had something in common. And actually, these two guys have a similar style, if you know them. I mean, I'm sure they're both incredibly annoying to each other as well, but we were lucky. You know, sometimes the constellation of people and events and randomness line up in a way. We were very lucky to have those four people be the people who are trying to get this agreement done for lots of different reasons, but mainly because they're a team, I think, that could problem solve together. In any case, what's in this agreement? So, what Iran does is in purple, and what we do is in red. So, we cap the enrichment level. So Iran, for some period of time, 15 years, most of this applies for 15 years. Different parts have different timelines, but it's mostly 15 years. They promise not to enrich above 3.67%. Remember, I told you need 80% to build a bomb. It caps the size of how much nuclear material they produce that they can have lying around in the middle of the table here, right? That they can have on hand. So they're only able to have 300 kilograms of low enriched uranium. Can't make a bomb with it. But that 300 kilograms represents a reduction of 98% of their stockpile. And that amount, if you took that 300 kilograms and tried to enrich it to bomb grade, it would not be enough for a single bomb. So we cap the enrichment, we cap how much they get to keep on hand. We cut the number of centrifuges that are operating by 2/3 down to roughly 5,000. There are restrictions on their centrifuge R&D, and we have tremendous access. Not only are we inspecting the facilities, we're able to inspect the facilities that make the machines. We inspect the facilities. We inspect the facilities that have the machines that make centrifuges, and we're able to inspect the facilities that make the machines that make the machines that make the centrifuges. We set up a dedicated procurement channel that'll track nuclear imports and exports. That'll help us make sure they're not doing anything on the side. We have enhanced inspections and safeguards. Basically, this is the most robust inspections regime that has ever existed in the 70 years of the nuclear age. So they've agreed to what are the toughest rules, which is called the additional protocol, and then they've agreed to go beyond the additional protocol. Again, I underline, not forever, but for some period of time, in most cases, the time being 15 years. And this is sort of in the woods, but essentially, I told you can get a bomb by making highly enriched uranium, or you can get a bomb by acquiring plutonium. That's a whole different process, and the agreement essentially takes out the plutonium route to the bomb, and I can explain why if you want to. And then if they start acting up, then we have this rather miraculous thing that I had great skepticism about, called snapback sanctions. And I can explain it in detail because it really is quite clever. But essentially, any member of the UN Security Council can go to the Security Council and say, we think Iran is in material breach, that they are in non-compliance with this agreement. And the moment one of the members says that, the clock starts ticking. And if after 30 days that isn't resolved, then sanctions are automatically reimposed. Which is quite something, because I would have never thought that Russia or China would give up their veto on the Security Council, but that's what they're giving up in this particular circumstance. Now, for its part, Iran gets an end to the UN-imposed missile embargo, so they can buy missile parts. We won't sell them stuff, but the international ban will end. Same thing with conventional weapons. The big one is lifting economic sanctions. That's really what Iran wants more than anything else, and in particular the banking and financial sanctions and the sanctions on oil sales. And the other thing they want, as a matter of pride, is to have this whole UN Security Council file closed and be done with. And they're getting that. This is my last slide, and I just thought I would open up the conversation. Not too far over. So we have had 2 years of negotiations. Remember, the agreement was announced in July, but we've been operating a year and a half prior to that under what was an interim deal. You probably don't even remember that, but in November of 2013, Iran agreed to stop producing 20% enriched uranium, which was the thing we were most freaked out about, and we lifted some minor economic sanctions. So they spent they spent 6 months negotiating that, another year and a half negotiating this, and people have criticized the interim deal, people have criticized the final deal. This became a giant political thing, which we can get into. Anti-deal organizations spent, well, AIPAC alone spent $14 million just on television ads attempting to defeat the deal. Others were players as well. And these are some of the critics: John Bolton, Netanyahu, Democratic Senator Menendez from New Jersey, also under indictment, and Senator Tom Cotton. I'm sorry to take that shot.
That's not fair. I'm from New Jersey and I know what that's about, and that's not fair.
Well, it's fair. He is under indictment. Now, whether he's guilty or innocent, I don't presume, but there's but the Justice Department has indicted him. True or false? Okay. So anyway, the folks who don't like the deal, they've had a set of arguments that have cycled through over time, different arguments at different times. But in the end, the one that they really went with is Iran is bad. We shouldn't have a nuclear agreement with them because Iran is bad. You know, they engage in terrorism and missiles and human rights abuses, and if we give them sanctions relief, they're going to do a lot more bad stuff. That was their main argument, especially down towards the end. They say Iran can't be trusted, it's just playing for time. The sanctions will, we'll do this agreement, the sanctions will collapse, they'll cheat, and then we won't be able to reimpose them because no one will have the stomach for that. What happens after 15 years? They'll be let off scot-free. If we allow them to enrich, this will cause other countries in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia, to seek nuclear weapons. We have to worry that they're going to break out, kick out the incinerator, sneak out, that they'll build clandestine facilities, And they raised all sorts of objections to the inspections and enforcement piece. And this is, again, more in the weeds. Iran, because it had this nuclear weapons program in the late 1990s that halted in 2003, there is a parallel investigation that the International Atomic Energy Agency is doing, looking into that nuclear past. And opponents to the deal said that Iran needed to plead guilty and get all these past violations clarified before any new deal could be accepted. And then when IAEA began to do that, the same critics said, well, IAEA is in bed with Iran. The same agency that they said was so important, then they said was in bed with Iran. We can get a better deal. Well, this is a bad deal. We can get a better deal. And what we really need is for Iran, we need zero enrichment. Remember, they had 164 centrifuges and refused to go to zero. We need to get them to zero. Total, complete dismantlement. That's the only deal we can accept. And then there's a whole set of things. The agreement should have included that Iran recognizes Israel, or Iran returns Americans being detained in Iran, or Iran does, any number of things that are not related to nuclear per se. So that's the list of objections. I've studied Iran for 15 years. My main focus is states that start down the path towards nuclear weapons stop and reverse course. That's what I spend my time on intellectually. And my own professional judgment was that this agreement was the most robust non-proliferation agreement ever negotiated in the history of non-proliferation. Stronger than the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, stronger than President Bush's agreement with Libya, stronger, the agreed framework with North Korea was 3 pages long. President George W. Bush's agreement, the Moscow Treaty with the Russians, was 3 pages long. This is 200 plus pages. So I am, and I appeared on television opposite many of these people. I'm definitely in the camp that they're wrong. That's where my bias is. You should know that right off. I think of all these arguments, the ones that I think is intellectually honest and a question worth asking is this: what's going to happen after 15 years? And I think that's a legitimate. The others, I think, are pretty much them throwing stuff up to see what'll stick. But you may have a different view, and we can discuss. We don't have to debate it, but you can ask me questions about it, or just express your points of view. So I think that that's the end. Is that the end? Yes, blessedly that is the end. So let me stop here, and why don't we pause? Now, I'm happy to facilitate myself.
You can facilitate the questions.
Alrighty. And you don't have to have a question. You can have a comment that you want me to react to. But you better ask something, or it's going to be a long hour and a half. Let's start. Or hour, I should say.
You said that Iran stopped their nuclear program.
Nuclear weapons program.
Nuclear weapons program in 2003. So I have a 2-part question. Why
Sure.
did they stop?
Yes.
And if they did, then why did we need this agreement?
Yes, so those are both great questions. And terrific questions, although you're only supposed to ask one.
That's why I made it a 2.
Oh, yes. I'm going to be watchful for that now. Clearly, we know who's going to be the violator of agreements. Why did they stop? No one knows. We'll only know when we get into if Iranian scholars get into the Iranian archives. There's a point of view that says, we had invaded Iraq in 2003, in early 2003, and this scared them. But by the time they agreed to negotiate, we were already having problems in Iraq. So that seems like that's plausible, but the timeline does not line up quite correctly. It could have been that this is a program that the Supreme Leader did not know about, and then came to know about. With Iraq being invaded, that certainly, the other question is, why did they start a nuclear weapons program? Why did they start it? Why did they end it? We don't know the answer to either of those. It would have not been surprising, given Saddam's revelations about Saddam's nuclear program, and having fought an 8-year bloody war with Saddam Hussein, that they would have suspected that he had a nuclear program, especially given the revelations that happened after the first Gulf War when he invaded Kuwait, and we saw that he had undeclared facilities. That might have spurred them to do it. Maybe with Iraq coming off the table, that sort of security threat wasn't going to be there anymore. But the short answer is we don't know. There are hypotheses, but we don't know the answer. And the second question, which is a fun one, if they didn't have a nuclear weapons program, why do we need the agreement? Is exactly what the Iranians say. Why are you hassling us? We don't have this. We'll agree to this, but the joke's on you because we don't have a weapons program. And I think the answer is, first of all, they ended their nuclear weapons program, but there was always, there's nothing that necessarily would stop them from restarting it at a certain point in the future. They had been, as this controversy got worse and worse over the years, beginning in 2005, we imposed sanctions, they tried to hit back. We imposed sanctions, they hit back. How did they hit back? How did they impose costs on us as we imposed costs on them? By building centrifuges and enriching. So once they started enriching to 20%, which they said they needed for a research reactor, that freaked out a lot of people in the non-proliferation community. Because enrichment is like pushing a big boulder. The tough part is in the beginning. Once the boulder's moving, it's easier. With enrichment, getting to 3 to 5% is the toughest part. When you're at 20, you're more than halfway there to producing 80%. So I think there's distrust, right? They had a secret program, so they clearly violated their obligations, their NPT obligations. As it was, because of the collapse negotiations, we were sanctioning them, and they were not letting IAEA into all the facilities. They were letting them into their enrichment facilities, but not so much to the heavy water facility. And so there continued to be suspicion about what they were doing and concern about what might happen in the future. I guess that's the way. And even today, there are basically a large number of people who simply do not accept the DNI's conclusions. They don't have any evidence to say that Iran has an active nuclear weapons program, but they believe it in their hearts. And it's essentially a religious argument. I believe this to be true. And that's very hard to argue with, but there are a large number of people who believe Iran has a nuclear weapons program, even though they don't have any evidence for that. Yes, ma'am.
So, I'm quite surprised how you convince China and Russia also to jump in the agreement. What do they have to win, and why did they change?
Yeah, that is awesome. Yes. So let me repeat the question. How is it, this very curious outcome, that Russia and China sort of went along with all this? And again, this shows you what a disappointing speaker I am. I'll have to say that we don't know, or I don't know. By the way, that is my most common and almost always my most accurate answer, is I don't know. Because it was a surprise in 2005 when the Russians and the Chinese got on board for sanctions. If you went back and read the newspapers in 2005, you have a lot of commentators saying, well, the Russians are out to get us and they'll collaborate with the Iranians and run interference and they'll never agree. And that wasn't the case. The Russian behavior is easier to explain than the Chinese behavior, but if I were to guess, and it would be a guess, it would be the following. Russia, and before it the Soviet Union, was always a very strong partner in non-proliferation. They don't want other countries to get the bomb. They want to keep the bomb for themselves. So the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was finished in 1968, came into force in 1970, that was co-written by the U.S. and the then Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union has been very pro-non-proliferation. Not so much pro-disarmament, getting rid of the weapons they have, but pro-non-proliferation. They don't want anyone else to have the weapons. And you'll remember, again, going back to that map, Iran is not that far. It straddles former states of the Soviet Union and is not that far from Russia itself. So the Russians have a tradition of non-proliferation. The Chinese have not come to this naturally, but as they have become more of an international player, then they, there are articles written about this, but I don't think there's any proof anywhere. There's at least a theory that says one way that China can demonstrate that it's a responsible great power in the international system is by playing along with things like this, international non-proliferation rules. In any case, the Chinese are not the type of country that's going to lead right, lead in any direction. They're going to stay in the shadows and stay behind. So if you have France, Germany, the US, Great Britain, and Russia all on board, which they did, then the Chinese aren't going to go off on their own, right? They may not enthusiastically be involved, but they're not going to go off on their own. I think the part of that question that is even, I was surprised that they supported the sanctions, and they did. But what's more surprising to me is they got on board with this idea of snapback sanctions, because that essentially takes power away from the Chinese and the Russians in the Security Council. This has never been done before, ever. It's probably not a good precedent for them. That's why it says in the agreement, nothing in this agreement will be taken as a precedent. But they agreed to do it, and I think there must have been an understanding. And again, 20 years from now, when young graduate students read the archives from the State Department, we'll have a much better idea of what actually happened. But my guess is the Americans made clear they absolutely had to have this, or there wouldn't be an agreement. And if the choice was between an agreement and no agreement, then they were going to go on. Would be my guess. Other questions from you shy people? Yes, sir.
So going back to what you talked about the centrifuges. And forgive me if I'm wrong. I'm just telling you.
I will not forgive you if you're wrong.
So, because I'm telling you what I've read in the media, and obviously I could have misunderstood it.
Sure.
And obviously, the media has its own biases.
Sure.
But my understanding was that they don't really need these centrifuges that they were building. They have tons of oil. They don't need it, and nuclear energy is incredibly expensive, and they can very cheaply extract their own oil.
Yes.
So I guess my question was, isn't the very fact that they were building the centrifuges and building this enrichment facility really just a way of saying, well, we may not be actually building a bomb, but we're building everything to be a screwdriver away from a bomb. So they kind of really were, adopting a nuclear program in disguise. What do you think? How would you respond to that?
I would have, if I can remember all three, I think I would have three things to say about that. One is we should be very cautious of the logic that takes the form of, I can't understand why they're doing something, it must be because of X. That is a very weak form of logic. When did we last hear that? I can't imagine why Saddam would prevent IAEA inspectors from coming into his facilities if he didn't have nuclear weapons. Right? What we couldn't think in our imagination was, he was doing it for other reasons. He didn't want to seem weak vis-a-vis his rivals in the region. So, a much stronger form of logic is we know X is true, we know Y is true, therefore Z. The form of logic that says X is happening, we don't understand it, it must be for this reason. Danger, flashing red danger signs on that. Second thing I would say is, form of logic aside, a little history is good here. So in the 1970s, the United States went to the Shah of Iran and tried to persuade him to build nuclear power plants. At that time, Iran was sitting on all the oil it's sitting on now. And the American, Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon, our American argument was, if you build nuclear power and supply your country with electricity through nuclear, then you'll be able to sell a lot more oil that was otherwise going for domestic consumption. And you'll be able to get into the higher end refined products to export, which is really where the money is. So we offered to sell them nuclear power plants. We encouraged them to join the European Enrichment Consortium at the time. Bad idea, probably. So then they, of course, choke on this when we make that argument. They say, are you kidding me? You were just in here trying to sell us this and telling us why it's so great. And now that we have, the other irony is, of course, that when the revolution took over in 1979, like Democratic or Republican presidential administration coming in after the bad guys are in power, everything that the previous regime did was wrong, and we're going to stop doing that. So when the revolution kicked out the Shah, they ended the nuclear program because it was associated with the Shah. They only didn't start to pick it up again until about halfway into the Iran-Iraq war in the mid-1980s. Now, again, the sort of form, at one level, I agree with you in a very specific way. The Iranian program raises suspicions, not because they have a nuclear power program when they have a lot of oil. A lot of countries, UAE is talking about this, Saudi Arabia is talking about it, Egypt talked about it for years. Countries can tell themselves all sorts of stories and narratives about why they want shiny, bright technologies. And there's usually a bureaucrat whispering into the ears of leadership about why this is such a fabulous idea. The thing that was really suspicious, if you ask me, is not their interest in nuclear power, but the fact that they had built enrichment, and their enrichment, no country in the history of the nuclear age had built so much enrichment with a nuclear program that had progressed so slowly. Right? They had far more enrichment capability than they needed for their current needs. Now their answer was, well, we need to, eventually we plan to refuel Bouchier ourselves, and so we're going to need, tens of thousands of centrifuges. But as I say, no other country followed that route. Normally you build power plants first, and then you build the centrifuges afterwards. And they were really getting ahead of themselves, and that did raise issues. Now, the third thing I will say is they did make a capability decision, but you can't have because they can build a centrifuge. But to have a nuclear weapon, you have to have a nuclear weapons program, right? There's no nuclear weapon absent a nuclear weapons program. You can't just have, the Dutch enrich, and the Japanese reprocess, and the Brazilians enrich, and everyone, lots of countries enrich and don't have nuclear weapons.
I guess that's my point. Like, I don't know enough about the science, but my sense is that there is no clear delineation as to what is a nuclear weapons program and then suddenly not. It's a very gradual kind of transition. So
yeah, and I would say
so the more nuclear technology you have, the more it is. And someone was telling me that if the Japanese wanted to, they could build a nuclear bomb that would be incredibly advanced in 3 months.
They could definitely do it quickly. I've heard that 3-month figure. It's taken every nuclear weapon state longer than that. But whether it's a year, it doesn't. It's functionally whether it's 3 months or a year, it doesn't matter. But they can't do it if they don't have a weapons program. It's not going to magically build itself. In other words, let's say you enrich uranium, a softball size amount of highly enriched uranium, which is good for one bomb. You can't throw it at someone. You have to build a device that will work. And it's the military and the military engineers that do that. So the program they stopped in 2003 was the military program. Absent a military program, you cannot have a nuclear weapon. And so, because there's still, and and that's what the whole issue of breakout time is, which we can go into if you want. I think it's an issue that receives far more attention than it should. But that's the breakout time is sort of what you were talking about for the Japanese. How much time would it take once you had bomb material to make it into a weapon? It's not a trivial thing, and you have to have an organization and a scientific enterprise to bring it into that last stage. But the hardest part is getting the material from an industrial standpoint. The hardest part is getting the material. But it is nevertheless, nuclear weapons have to be at the highest level of technical reliability. You cannot, hit a button, fire a missile, and have the missile come down on your own territory, right? You can't do this with 1% errors. The requirements for a military device, a nuclear device, are exceedingly high. So there's a whole separate stage once you get the material, which is the hardest part, but there's nevertheless a challenging and non-trivial stage of taking that material and making it into weapons and being able to deliver those weapons. Most first-generation nuclear weapon states, their bombs are so big and crude they won't fit on missiles. That's why every nuclear weapon state has used planes for its first delivery vehicle. But this is part of, you raise an important issue, and it's been part of the agreement. Coming back to your question, why have an agreement? Advocates for the agreement would say, as it currently stands, if Iran had decided to break out, it could produce enough nuclear material for a single bomb. By the way, no one does that. There's never been an instance where people break out to build one bomb. It doesn't make any sense, but that's the standard people use. If they went to do that, it would take them 2 or 3 months, plus the year, at point X, to take that material and turn it into a bomb. So that's 2 months of breakout time under the current conditions. Under the agreement, that breakout time gets extended to at least a year. So it's a year to produce that material. Remember, they're giving up all the stockpile, they're cutting back the number of centrifuges, they're limiting the enrichment level. So if they kicked out all the inspectors, it would take them a year to generate 1 bomb's worth of material, and then an additional year to fashion that into a weapon, as compared to the status quo, where that number is not 12 months, it's 2 months. So, in general, I think the program was suspicious, right? Because they secretly built their centrifuges, right, that got discovered, and they put a lot more effort into enrichment than their civilian nuclear program would seem to warrant. So it's suspicious. But of course, they had a bomb program that they stopped in 2003. So those timelines they do correspond. But then they say no after 2003, so there's no military program, as best as the U.S. intelligence can tell. Yes, ma'am.
So how do you think the political landscape is going to change with this deal in place and at the end of the 15-year mark?
Yes.
Are other countries now going to start responding to we need to prep ourselves for what's to happen in 15
Yes,
years?
yes.
Or and I guess going off of that, why is it not 100 years? If you're
Yes.
not truly interested, why isn't this for 100 years
Yes.
versus just 15? How's that going to affect the political landscape?
Okay, you were very clever how you worked in 2 questions, too. So the
Kinda goes
questions
hand in
were,
hand.
what's going to happen after 15 years? Will other countries start hedging their bets and getting involved in nuclear stuff now because they worry about what will happen after 15 years? And what was the second piece of that?
Why not 100?
Why not 100? Let's start with the second one first. Why not make this agreement for 100 years? Because this is a voluntary negotiation among sovereign states, and they won't agree to 100 years. As remember that point before that I said Iranians speak in broad cultural terms that are completely illegitimate and inappropriate. Have a chip on their shoulder, think that they're under siege, think that they don't get the respect they deserve, insist that they be treated like a normal country. They're not going to, no country has agreed to a set of restrictions that would only apply to them for 100 years. No sovereign state's going to do that. No sovereign state can go back to their own population and say, that's the deal we negotiated. Right? Because they have hardliners too. So their hardliners were attacking their negotiators as our hardliners were attacking our negotiators. So and people say, why not zero enrichment? Well, as I said, in 2005, when they had 164 centrifuges, they refused zero. They're not going to go to zero when they have 19,000, and they're not going to agree to 100 years when there's no country on the planet that has agreed to a similar sort of thing. So part of that is just the reality. I'm sure we asked for 30, right? And they said 5, and they settled on 15. Now, I want to stress that different pieces of it have different timelines. So, for example, we have access to their mines for 25 years. Some pieces of this are in perpetuity. There are NPT obligations, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty obligations, where they say they will not develop a nuclear weapon. Those are forever. The adoption of the additional protocol would be forever. When we go in and blow up their old heavy water reactor and redesign and give them a new one that's less of a proliferation threat, when you start up that reactor and it goes hot, you can't go back in 15 years later and redo it because it's radioactive. So that's forever. They'd have to build a whole new reactor. So there are aspects of the deal that do go on forever. There's some that go on for 20 years, some that go on for 15, some for 10, some for 8. But the core thing is they're a sovereign state in a voluntary negotiation. And that means they get a say at the table, and they can walk away too. Now, as for what happens after 15 years, I think it's a great question, but I'm not as concerned about the part of it that might worry you. You're asking about, well, what will these other countries do? And you'll remember on that list of critics' arguments, there was an argument that said, well, this will cause proliferation if we allow them to have, where is it? Oh, yeah, right there. Allowing enrichment will cause them. And I say, as a non-proliferation expert, that's a very curious thing to say. Because of the 10 nuclear weapon states that we've had, not a single one, not a single state developed a nuclear weapon in response to a legal, regulated enrichment program. That's never happened in 7 decades, right? It also comes in a context of, if I can go all the way back, that, right? I would say additionally, if Iran has had centrifuges since 2003, it's 2015. If Saudi Arabia was going to be freaked out about this and get into the enrichment game, why have they done nothing in a decade? Why, now that we're cutting their stockpile by 98%, their centrifuges by 2/3, that now's the time they would suddenly be interested in doing that? That doesn't add up for me. But I do think the issue of, so I don't worry about, first of all, as I argue, proliferation's been incredibly robust, far better than anyone would have guessed. So you don't get big proliferation cascades. And we've never had an example in history of, again, this particular variation causing a nuclear weapons program. But I do think there's a legitimate question about what happens after 15 years. And some people will say, and we don't know because we don't know what the future holds. Some people say, well, when that 15-year limit's up, they're gonna, go for the bomb. Now, of course, they're still being inspected under the additional protocol. They still have their obligations under the NPT. They'd still have to violate stuff. They'd have to change their mind, right? Because right now they haven't made the bomb decision. So we have to project a point 15 years in the future where they change their minds and then try to cheat even though they're still under inspection. And that's possible. But I guess I take comfort in what the DNI said. What has the DNI said? He says this is not a technical issue. It depends on Iran's political will. And so Iran, the way I like to describe it is Iran is at a fork in the road. It hasn't decided what its nuclear weapons future is going to be. But what we're doing is locking them into a policy path that extends for 15 years. First of all, 15 years is like, might as well be 100 years. In the Middle East, ISIS didn't exist 5 years ago. Right now it's the most important thing in the region, among others. And 15 years is 150 years in nuclear years, dog years. Because the thing about nuclear weapons programs, remember that group of 30 that started and stopped? What kills these programs is delay. The states that become nuclear weapon states are the states that say, I want it now, and I'm going to make the military and the scientific bureaucracy who hate each other, I'm going to force them to work together because this is my top political priority. The ones who say, I'm sort of interested in it, I want to keep it open as an option, they don't become nuclear weapon states. Because when it comes to nuclear weapons, and this will sound odd, the engineering is harder than the science. We always think of it as a scientific challenge. The engineering is harder than the science. Program management is harder than the engineering, and the politics is harder than the program management. It's political will and sustaining a 10-year-long enterprise that produces nothing till the very, very, very end. That's a hard thing to do. And my own guess is over 15 years, some people think they'll come out and decide to go for the bomb. If it's the current international circumstances that we enjoy now, which it won't be, but for the purposes of guessing, if it's more or less where we're at now, I think what you'll find is the nuclear program is going to fade away, right? The nuclear program has been not only a bomb program, but a matter of national pride and politics. It's the thing that they've waved, look, we beat the outside world, we accomplished this, even though they got this technology from Pakistan, no one ever talks about that, And it's not very well developed and whatever, but they don't say that. They say, we built this shiny scientific thing, we're an advanced country, they can't deny us our nuclear rights. So every time we push, they would push back. Well, I think the air is going to come out of the balloon on this. I think 15 years is a really long time. A lot of those folks, they're going to have to find other jobs, doing other things. And over that 15 years, my guess is they're going to have to start investing in that natural gas. They sit on the second largest natural gas reserves in the world and have not explored them at all. I mean, they're idiots, really. That should be their top priority. Well, now that nuclear's off the table, that's going to be and it's not treated as a priority issue that enjoys all this psychological and political salience, when it's just now has to compete as just another energy form, my guess is they'll go with natural gas, and this thing will fade. But we don't know. And so I think, as we prepare for the next 15 years, I think this is an excellent point. I don't think the states in the region are going to prepare by becoming, acquiring enrichment facilities. But I think what we can do is begin to think about what the next agreement, a follow-on agreement, is. We can't impose 100 years of restrictions that they're going to accept, but we can say, let's negotiate. We've had this one, we had the interim deal, we had this joint plan of action. This is working for both of us. Let's negotiate another deal on the basis of more for more. You do more, we'll give you more. Right? Because agreements work because people buy in. Agreements, if one side gets all the benefits and the other doesn't, that agreement doesn't last. So what we want Iran to do at this fork in the road when it has not yet made the bomb decision is to buy into this. And then it has a momentum and things take over. That's what's happened in most of the other states. It started and then stopped. Yes, sir.
I kind of have a question that goes back a little bit. I read that the inspections are more thorough than it would be with any other country.
Yes.
And they can get access to any facility they suspect of being somehow related to the enrichment program, right?
Right now they have the declared facilities, and those are under 24/7. If we suspect they're building an undeclared facility, in other words, if they're cheating, then yes, we have the right to go.
And how easy is it for other countries that don't have this extra clause to have a clandestine nuclear program, since we can't just go in and inspect any facility?
Yeah, I hear you. And I would prefer that each time we write these precedent-breaking strong safeguards, that they become universally adopted. That would be my preference, despite the line that says this is not a precedent for the future. Well, what you point to is a real problem. It's one that the community, though, has wrestled with. Flashback to 1991. If Saddam invades Kuwait, he gets kicked out, IAEA goes in, and what do they find? They find that Saddam had undeclared facilities. Because under the old rules, IAEA could only inspect declared facilities. So inspectors would go to Iran, and Saddam would say, not literally, but Saddam would say, look here, and that looks fine. One building over, these bad things are happening, but they can't look there. So after that debacle, and the way the non-proliferation regime has changed over time, gotten stronger and stronger over time, it's crisis leads to action, crisis leads to action. And so in this case, this crisis of undeclared facilities led to the development of what we now call the additional protocol, which is meant specifically to deal with that problem, the problem of undeclared facilities. And so most countries that have nuclear, again, not nuclear weapons, nuclear programs, civilian nuclear programs, have signed the additional protocol. Only a handful are out of it right now. And that gives the agency the ability to go to any facility in the country, military or otherwise, if it has cause for concern. This is the Iran agreement is much more robust in that way because it's got some enforcement powers and it's got some other things that make this happen much faster and of much higher consequence. But the basic concept of we need to deal with undeclared facilities, that was a problem. The international community responded with this new set of rules and new set of technologies, environmental sampling and other public open source information tracking, that sort of thing. But I wish it were more robust, yes. But there's certainly improvement over what it was in the 1990s.
Thanks.
Yes, ma'am, and then you?
So in terms of prior to the revolution, Israel and Iran didn't have the worst relationship in the world.
Right.
And it was even questioned about whether or not that was going to be the first country in the Middle East that Israel was going to be make peace with.
Yes.
Clearly not the case anymore.
Yes.
But with this deal,
Yes.
and with what are the implications on civil society in Iran?
Yes.
And also potentially, is that going to stay neutral? Is that going to even be worse because of Bibi? Or is this potentially going to improve the relationship with Israel?
Well, that's a lot of questions.
Sorry.
I would say you're certainly right to, just as to begin with a footnote, always a bad idea. Yes, Israel had strong relations with the Shah behind the scenes, in part, and with Turkey. Why? Because Iran is not Arab, Turkey is not Arab, Israel is not Arab. And so there was an axis of common interest on some things that provided the basis for that cooperation. You know, impact on civil society in Iran. This is a big win for Rouhani and the centrists and the pragmatists. And the feeling is, and the thing to watch is the February election in Iran that will elect the Assembly of Experts, which is the group that selects the supreme leader, is this next election for their legislature and for the Assembly of Experts. Rouhani is hoping to have this agreement and roll it into political momentum, whereas his hardliner opponents were trying to kill the deal because they feared exactly that. Just like Republicans didn't want to give Obama a win. You know, if Obama said the night is dark and the day is bright, the Republicans would pass a resolution saying the opposite is true or something, right? Same thing. Hardliners are trying to deny Rouhani a win because they fear what the implications would be, which would be a more engaged Iran with the rest of the world, in which you see benefits from sanctions relief will lead to political support for moderates and centrists. That's the hope. We'll know in another couple of years whether that's true or not. As far as Israel-Iranian relations, you know, I think that's going to be, and most of this is at the rhetorical level, right? They're not actually doing, I mean, if they shared a border, it would be one thing.
Right.
But it's like the kids in school who are being held back and trying to hit each other, knowing that, hoping that their friends won't let go because they actually don't want to fight the person. This is hot rhetoric, but you know, when they were sending ships to bust the blockade in Gaza, Iranian citizens tried to organize one of those, and the supreme leader squashed it, wouldn't let them do it, right? Because they don't want to have a direct conflict. The two sides don't want to have a direct conflict, and they don't share a border, and they really don't share interests that most countries fight over. Most countries fight over disputed territory, or you know, or they fight over I'm going to get your oil wells. None of that exists in the Israel-Iran relationship. So most of this just happens at the rhetorical level, and it's useful for both sides, right? As long as Netanyahu's talking about Iran, he's not talking about settlements in Gaza. So I don't see the political incentive structure changing much. I certainly don't see this particular prime minister doing anything that would improve that relationship. And of course, there will always be hardliners in Iran who are going to say outrageous, ugly stuff that helps keep the, you know, that fire burning, that rhetorical fire burning. So I think it will have an impact on Iranian society. I think there's a good chance that will be the case. I don't expect big changes in 15 years in Israel. You know, if they, I mean, it'd be interesting. This isn't going to happen, but if Israel did settle up with the Palestinians, I mean, I think it would be interesting. Iran is sort of in a box in that because that's really what they're basing their opposition to, is the Palestinians. But that's not even I'm that optimistic about that.
So, I just want to say quickly, so it is 7:30 now, so we have to go. Okay. Have to go.
Yeah.
We are going to stick around until we get this out, though, so feel free to stay and continue the conversation.
But you had a question. I wanted to let you.
Yeah, no problem. Actually, Rachel took a lot of it, but I guess my question was, it was around Israel. But it's in the, if you're saying right now that they didn't have a lot of this program, and so maybe they feel like they're not giving up as much as we think they're giving up, but they get an improved economy. And I know, and one of the other things, I guess, my question is, they also seem to get missiles out of this. And I guess I was curious, like, having a nuclear weapon is a great threat, but to your point, like, you don't really want to do it, right? Like, it's clearly not politically acceptable to use nuclear weapons. No one does this.
Right.
And missiles seem like a more politically acceptable way to conduct war these days.
Unfortunately,
And I'm just wondering whether that's part of the motivation of what they get as well. They're like, okay, we get a better economy, we get a weapon we can actually use. And I was going to ask in relation to Israel, but I was just curious about the role of like other military things they can now do because these sanctions have been lifted.
Well, let me talk about Iran's motivation for doing this. I think the driving motivation here is the economy. Again, Rouhani was elected, not only was his election was a surprise, being elected on the first ballot was a stunner and a shocker. And given what had happened in 2009 and the impact of sanctions, it wasn't just sanctions, it was Ahmadinejad's mismanagement of the Iranian economy. The supreme leader was hearing that he had a population that was, Rouhani was the only candidate that endorsed nuclear negotiations and engagement. And so that sent a shockwave through the political establishment. The CIA, according to the LA Times, has done an assessment. They expect the vast majority of these funds to go into economic development. A lot of it is already obliged. I mean, there's this $150 billion figure. It's really closer to $29 billion because they owe countries, those monies sitting in the foreign bank accounts that got frozen are actually owed to, the Chinese and the Indians for goods and services already delivered. And there's a report this week, I don't know if they'll do it, that they'll keep that money in those banks to sort of raise their sovereign wealth situation. But presumably in the gross, if they're doing better, they should have more money to do nefarious things. I think that that's probably true. But terrorism isn't exactly very expensive. I don't think that was the limit. And frankly, if you look at Iran, they're really on the defensive. They're in Syria playing defense, and their partner's losing, right? And in Iraq, they're playing defense. They're trying to kill ISIS, like we're trying to kill ISIS. But I expect the Revolutionary Guard, which is large, and it's hard to make big generalizations about an entity that large, it certainly has nefarious people and organizations, and I'm sure they'll do bad things. But what I used to say to people about this is, if you don't like Iran, you don't like terrorism, you don't like the other human rights, whatever it might be, the only thing worse than Iran that does terrorism and human rights problems is Iran that does terrorism and human rights problems and has a nuclear weapon, right? And if they don't get sanctions relief, there's going to be no nuclear agreement. There's no such thing as a nuclear agreement without sanctions relief. 0% probability. If I punish you because I'm trying to get you to change your behavior, and then you say, okay, I'll change my behavior, and I say, that's great, but you should know I'm going to keep punishing you. No, that's not possible in any planet in the solar system. That deal does not exist. Now, as for the missiles, this is the international missile embargo. It was imposed in Resolution 1929 as a nuclear punishment, right? So if I'm saying you can't have missiles and I'm punishing you for your nuclear behavior, and I say that's why I'm doing it, and then you agree to change your nuclear behavior, again, it's sort of hard to say, well, but I'm going to keep punishing you because I have other reasons. That doesn't work. So that was actually, they capitulated on that. That's where the Iranians, I'm sure the Iranians thought they were going to get relief on the missile and conventional weapons on day one. That actually doesn't kick in until 5 years and 8 years. So remember, all these things have different timelines. So that embargo stays for another 8 years. And we'll keep on ours on forever, presumably. And I think, I wish people wouldn't sell missiles to the region. I wish they wouldn't buy missiles. But the Iranians feel like they need to have some deterrent against Israel because they don't share a land border. So how can you hit back at a state that is stronger than you? Qualitatively, Israel's military is larger and they spend more. How do they deter Israel from striking Iran, which Israel threatens on a periodic basis? Hezbollah. Right? If you hit Iran, Hezbollah will send rockets into Israel. And they're probably thinking of their missile program as a deterrent, since they're not going to fly planes, they have a crappy Air Force. But a missile gives you some weak deterrence against a prospective attack by another country. So I'm guessing that that's their theory.
It sounds like you don't read them as the aggressor, I guess, is my take on the response.
Well, they haven't invaded anyone.
Yeah.
All right, so I would say name a country Iran has invaded.
Fair point.
So I think they're a status quo power. They always have been. And I think they're more concerned about internal threats than external threats. Right, the IRGC mostly is about domestic order. There's the Quds Force, which goes and plays in Yemen and Lebanon. But most states, they worry about and that was on that list of interests. One was oil, and one was internal security and external security. External security is other states threatening you. In this case, Israel has done that a lot. I don't think Israel's going to do it, but they do it a lot. And internal security, between those two, I think the Supreme Leader worries way more about internal security than external security. And I think 2009 is evidence, case evidence number one as to why he worries about that. Yes, sir.
Maybe to get to the point of like internal security and internal people there, this might be a difficult question to answer because it's kind of a broad question, but for, around kitchen tables here in the US, certainly around 2003, and on Jimmy Fallon and all the talk show, like there's all kinds of jokes like Ahmadinejad, a little tough to say name, that's a funny name, but like he's part of the conversation here, though it's kind of come in waves, like when he came to the US, then everybody's talking about it, and then it kind of goes away, and it comes back, and it goes away. Like, what is the conversation in Iran about nuclear weapons? Like, is that something that people are talking about around the kitchen table? Like, boy, glad we're at 20%. This is exciting. Or is it just like, why is this a big deal? Could we please get rid of these sanctions? This is cool.
It's mostly the latter, but it has evolved over time. Let me start by just being clear that Ahmadinejad is not coming back. By the time it was the last 2 years of his presidential term, his second term, the debate in Iran, the whisper debate was he going to be arrested or were they going to let him fill out his term? He managed to alienate everyone, every important constituency in Iran. And there's much to be said about him. And I won't say it all now. But it is good fortune that he has left the political scene in Iran and he will not return.
Good fortune for him?
For all concerned. It's good for everyone. It's good for us, it's good for them, it's good, it's just good. As to Iranian attitudes about nuclear weapons, I think it's still mainly, why are they hassling us? We don't have a bomb. The main Iranian theory is we're all about regime change. And this nuclear stuff, if it's nuclear today, and we agree to a nuclear deal, it'll be something else tomorrow. But the main thing is we're an Islamic republic that stands up against the U.S. and they want regime change. And frankly, regime change is not the policy of the U.S., but there is a very high plurality of American policymakers I've talked to who have said, in a closed meeting, well, if I had my way, we'd have regime change, but we can't do that. So they're not far off, but the U.S. policy is not regime change. And I think most Iranians, certainly there was a time early in this dispute, let's say 2003, where unanimously Iranians would have said, we don't want nuclear weapons, we have no interest in nuclear weapons. And of course the Supreme Leader keeps coming out and says, we have a fatwa, which is a religious ruling saying that nuclear weapons are haram, they're against Islam as we understand it. And so that reinforces that message, which I think is helpful, because that's another constraint. But in any case, but I think the longer this thing went on, the dispute, so it starts 2003, 2005, we're now at 2015. I think over time, still, nuclear weapons have never received majority support in any polling that's been done in Iran. But support for it did increase from, 5% higher and higher over time, as I think, and this is just pure speculation on my part, where Iranians came to say, well, screw it. If they're going to keep punishing us for this, we might as well get one. That is my kitchen table psychological guess as to why those numbers started to move over time. But still, the overwhelming majority reject nuclear weapons and don't think that their government is, they continue to deny that they have a nuclear weapons program. Right? They deny that they have a nuclear weapons program. The government has never accepted the claim that they had a weapons program from the late 1990s and stopped it in 2003. They've rejected that they've ever had a program, and they keep pointing to this fatwa as evidence that they would never do so. I think they're lying, but I think it wouldn't be surprising if Iranians believed that. But they do like, why do they like it? Because it shows that they're modern, and they beat the other guys, all tried to deny them from having it, and they were able to do it despite all the opposition from the evil imperial powers. and it's science and technology, and we're modern and great, and the other countries don't have it.
And at this point, it's like, we just want these sanctions lifted, so that,
Right.
like,
Well, and that's why-
and that's another thing to cheer for, that they can cheer internally.
Exactly, but that also very much, I'm glad you said that, explains in part why zero was never going to be an option, zero enrichment. Because after having invested all this, you know, any leader that then would, already Rouhani and Zarif are being accused by their hardliners of having capitulated, sold the goods, you know, sold out Iranian interests with this agreement. Whereas the hardliners here say that about us. And that's with this agreement, where they get to keep an enrichment program. But why do they get to keep an enrichment program? Because they were never going to give it all up, in part because they would never be able to face their own population politically and say that.
It's almost like they had to compromise.
I know, isn't it odd? Yes, it's all compromise thing. Yes. Oh, let me, before you go, because you did go once before, let me ask if anyone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question would like to ask a question.
I can get it on the
Okay. Yes, sir.
So I really wanted to just what the biggest question I had coming in here was, why do the Israelis really hate this deal? And I researched on, I went and I read English newspapers that are published in Israel, like Haaretz. And my understanding is that it isn't just Netanyahu, it's across the Israeli political spectrum. And it's mainstream informed opinion. In fact, the version of you in Israel, their institute, like wrote a whole article saying it's really terrible.
Yes.
So I guess the second part of what I'm trying to understand about Israel is, and again, forgive me if I'm wrong, I just don't know enough about the Middle East. But my understanding was that Israel would rather not, has no reason to really get into it with Iran, and before the revolution under the Shah had great relations. And if Iran would be like, look, we don't want to threaten you, Israel will be like, well, we don't want to get, and it would be quite happy to have relations that are good with Iran. So when you say Israel threatened by Iran, I feel like my understanding of the situation is that Israel, if Iran will be like, we don't want to threaten your existence, we don't want to deny your existence, we don't want to wipe you off the map, as they've literally said, Israel will be like, fine, let's have diplomatic relations, let's stop thinking about each other's adversaries tomorrow. Israel has no reason, other than the fact that Iran says that it's an adversary, to make Iran an adversary.
Well, I think there are strong domestic political reasons why this serves politicians in Israel. But let's start with where you started. I would say you're largely correct in saying that the polling shows that, in general, the public is with Netanyahu on this as a national security issue. And certainly the active policymakers, that's true. They fall into line and become silent. If you read a lot of Haaretz articles and op-eds, then you will have seen the other side. Because what you've seen is retired Israeli military and intel people come out in favor of the deal. Right? You had the former head of Shin Bet, you had the former head of Mossad, you had the former head of the Israeli Atomic Energy.
But the other political parties, the opposition, the opposition, Labour in Israel, the Labour Party in Israel, they are against this deal.
Yeah. Well, you know, I could pick lots of things that Democrats would be against. I guess my point is that the national security establishment, whose job it is to protect Israel's security, those folks who are retired came out in large numbers in favor of the deal. There was a letter signed by 49 of them. It was published in the New York Times. I mean, I know many of these people personally. I know, for example, the former head of the Israeli Atomic Energy Agency used to be the secretary to the National Security Committee and fought in, you know, he certainly fought in 67, 70, 73. I don't know if they fought in 56 and 48. This guy's like 80 years old. But, you know, these are people whose job, if you look at the Israeli military's assessment, like the U.S., they do a threat assessment every year. They did it in April. Haaretz covered it. And what they said was they were assuming the deal was going to be adopted and that their 10-year outlook going forward was positive, their security outlook was positive. And in listing the things they were concerned on, Iran was not on that list.
So is Obama right then that Netanyahu misunderstands is the strategic interests of Israel, and that like really Israel should be in favor of this deal?
Oh, I think there's no doubt that Israel should be in favor of the deal. I mean, the
So,
idea...
so a large portion of the Israeli establishment of politicians misunderstand their own national interests.
Yeah, gee, when does that ever happen? You know, how about the Iraq War, the war in Iraq? There are lots of times, for reasons of party politics, that states make military and security decisions that are against their national interests. I mean, you know, the Iraq War would be a gigantic example in which both parties supported the war. Now, why did the Democrats support the war in Iraq when they voted for that authorization? Because they didn't want to be politically left out in the cold. Many of them wanted to run for president. In other words, there's domestic politics that's an important component here. Now, I can't analyze Netanyahu's motivations. Certainly, he's never presented an alternative to the deal. Never. Right? So that last speech before Congress, I mean, it's pretty interesting. It's the same speech he always gives. But is, you know, Iran is Hitler. This is the 1930s. Iran has tentacles. It's going to swallow up all these countries. It's inherently evil. And my alternative is we should negotiate a better deal. So he's saying they're Hitler, but his answer is we can do a better job at the bargaining table with Hitler. You know, that doesn't add up. There is no alternative being presented. I cannot speak to why. You know, I'm not an Israeli. I don't do Israel-Palestine. I have enough problems with the stuff with Iran and Sharia, other than, you know, that I don't devote a lot of time to this. But this deal is the strongest nuclear non-proliferation deal ever signed in 70 years. It reduces dramatically the likelihood that Iran will acquire a nuclear weapon. So I think that's in Israel's self-interest. And I think the 49 retired military and intel people agree with me. Any deal that reduces the chances that Iran gets a nuclear weapon is good for Israel. But, you know, you will have to ask Netanyahu why, you know, and again at the UN, I think it was today, also the same speech. So I don't know.
You have to get them in here for our next.
You have to get them in. They'll come up to Harvard or MIT at some point. You can grab them in.
Get to your right.
So I wanted to sort of take a sort of totally different viewpoint on the whole thing, because I think that we're analyzing this thing in great detail and I think very accurately. But if you step back and look at, you know, there's a lot of unanticipated consequences that come out. And so if you analyze each one, then you come out to a dead end. Well, this can't happen, this can't happen, this can't happen. On the other hand, you know, look at Korea, right? We did all this stuff, you know, people knew what was going to happen in the end. They were going to get a nuclear weapon. You know, there were a lot of negotiations and people were optimistic, pessimistic. In the end, they got a nuclear bomb. You know, there are just so many ways things can happen. I think that I really admire the idea of analyzing things logically. But I also like to step back once in a while and look at the possibility of, well, there's so many different things that can happen that in Iran with nuclear weapons, a lot of things can happen. For example, over the following 20 years, a terrorist could get a hold of the weapon. You know, who knows? God knows who in the government or somewhere at some level might not be able to do nuclear weapons somewhere else. All sorts of things can happen that one doesn't even analyze at this point because we're looking at the thing with detail. And so if one steps back and looks at unanticipated consequences, then that's the game I think it's sort of playing out. And then they say, well, wait a second, we talked to Bush, we talked to Obama, you know, and there's always a shell game. Well, yeah, if we give them this many centrifuges, they'll never get a bomb. If we give them this many, they'll never get a bomb. But guess what? There's a threshold to getting a bomb. You've got to take the unanticipated consequences. And at that point, it's not that illogical a conclusion. If you sort of take that global viewpoint of, well, wait a second, if we just step back, we better be really careful, because this may be the best deal in the world, but how the hell did we get here? See what I'm saying? How the hell did we get to the point where this is the best possible deal we could get? If we had 10, 12 years to do other things that maybe could have kept them from being 2 months away from building a nuclear weapon. I wasn't here at the beginning of your talk, so you know much better than I do how far away they are, or whatever it is. You see what I'm saying?
Well, I think we had that opportunity, and we, oh yeah. So, this is going to be a hard question to synthesize. Part of it is about unintended consequences, the notion of focusing on the details too much.
Well, look at Korea. We can look at the details of the discussions that went on and off for the 10, 15 years people tried to stop Korea. Korea now has a nuclear weapon. We may argue, well, so what? You know, it has a nuclear weapon, but the so what's built up over the years.
Yeah,
A lot of
I just,
possibilities occur, that you can't control.
well, again, I agree that you have to look at context. And the context says that's an outlier, right? First of all, the agreed framework worked. For 8 years, North Korea shut down its reactor and didn't have long-range missile tests. 8 years. Who wouldn't vote for that now? I'd love to freeze their program and freeze long-range missile tests right now. But the Bush administration came in and said they weren't going to negotiate with evil, right? And they confronted the North Koreans, and the North Koreans pulled out, and that's where we are today. We could have had a deal in 2005 with the Iranians when they had 164 centrifuges, and maybe they would have gone to 2,000. But we said no, and that collapsed, and then we went from 164 to 19,000. Again, I sort of asked myself, this is why the front part of the talk was about, well, what's the general state of nonproliferation? North Korea is the unbelievable outlier. Name another country that's done that. There is none. Zero. Right? Agreements have turned out to be incredibly powerful policy instruments for preventing people from acquiring nuclear weapons. The NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. Allows for weapons tests. Does nothing about nuclear materials. A treaty that never would have passed Congress now turns out to be the most important national security treaty ever passed and helped keep those countries from acquiring nuclear weapons. Those countries that were interested in nuclear weapons. So I think the overall record of proliferation gives us reasons to be more optimistic than pessimistic. The track record with agreements suggests that they're incredibly powerful, surprisingly powerful insofar as they're only bits of paper. And there are reasons why I think they turn out to be powerful. And as far as unintended consequences, I'm sure there'll be unintended consequences, and some of them will be positive, and some of them will be negative. But as far as transferring a bomb to a third party, this agreement makes it less likely Iran gets a bomb in the first place. So if it doesn't get a bomb, it can't transfer it to a third party. I don't think states are into that, by the way. I don't think there's any evidence that suggests states want to do that.
And you don't see kind of a breakdown, generalized breakdown, which is the lack of interest in the international community. The whole thing kind of just fizzles away, and Iran does what it wants to and sanctions are kind of tough to reapply. You don't see that scenario as being likely at all?
Well, the snapback sanctions are automatic, and
is that, do you believe in that? Are they really automatic?
Yes. The short answer is yes.
Okay. I don't know.
Yeah, it's, as I say, it's the most remarkable, aside from the nuclear stuff, it's the most remarkable feature of the agreement, is the snapback. Because it takes...
that nations will actually listen to the snapback, will actually allow the snapback to...
Well, the snapback is imposed. Now, there's nothing that can stop that. There'll be a separate question about then, well, once the international community passes their sanctions, will they abide by them? I don't see the Europeans rejecting a UN, mandate
and you think the
on
UN
sanctions.
would mandate something like that in a snapback situation? The UN would actually pass something?
They don't have to pass. That's not the way the mechanism works. Right, so it is worth describing. So any member of the UN Security Council can come and say Iran is in non-compliance. The moment they say that, a 30-day clock starts. Unless what they did was they turned everything on its head, which is really quite clever. After 30 days, those sanctions are automatically reimposed. The only thing that would prevent those sanctions from being reimposed
by the United Nations.
By the United Nations. The only thing that prevents those sanctions from being reimposed is if the Security Council passes a resolution saying that sanctions relief would be extended. At which point the U.S. can use its veto authority. Right, so, and in any case, the banking and financial sanctions are extraterritorial. Right, we impose those on others. But
if the U.S. has the willpower itself.
Yeah, I don't think, we'll have to wait and see. Iran is the most watched country in the world. Do I think Israel's going to stop hating Iran now that there's a nuclear agreement? No, I don't. Do I think Saudi Arabia is going to stop hating Iran now that there's a nuclear agreement? No, I don't. So I think there are going to be plenty of countries out there who are going to be looking for the first sign, hint of non-compliance. I think some of them will probably make stuff up. We've seen that happen too. We'll fabricate things. I think, I don't see the region doing much better anytime soon. So I think Iran will continue to be the most watched country in the world. And certainly will have sufficient enemies that people will be looking for the slightest opportunity to charge them with non-compliance. So I'm not so much worried about that. But I don't, and I don't know what the unintended consequences will be. And the big thing is, I have no idea what that region's going to look like in 15 years. Right? That's sort of the kicker. And it's just impossible. I can't say what the region's going to look like in 5 years. I just have no idea.